God's friend. Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 8, and verses 16 through 33. In chapter 12, the Lord made a personal visitation to Abraham to see if Abraham was ready to be the father of nations as well as the friend of God. Abraham was more than just God's friend in James chapter 2, verse 23, but God's friend forever. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 7, King James Version. Yet how exactly does a friend treat his God, his family, and his neighbors? How does a friend respond to a doomed neighbor? What can he or she offer to a world that is lost and dying? What can you do for ungodly and unrepentant sinners? First, be hospitable in service. Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Abraham's hospitality to God will later be contrasted with Saddam's hostility to God. He jumped into action in the hot day, in verse 1, the moment he saw the strangers, especially when he could guess their identity. He bowed low, in verse 2, and brought the 3 men water, in verse 2, and bread, in verse 5. The patriarch humbly called himself your servant twice, in verses 3 and 5, prepared the choicest calf for a feast, in verse 7, and stood in respect, in verse 8, while they ate. Abraham did his fair share of running that day. In the heat of the day, when it was not cool or conducive, in verse 1, he ran, in King James Version, to meet them, in verse 2, and ran, in verse 7, to select a choice tender calf for the meal. Another word to describe his determination and delight to serve the Lord is the repetition of hurried, mahar, or quick, in verse 6, and hurried again in verse 7, meaning sped, quicken. The 3 words are the same in Hebrew. Altogether, Abraham used 6 imperatives that day to express his delight in serving. Wash and rest in verse 4, refresh in verse 5, quick and knead and bake in verse 6. Second, be heightened in sensitivity. Genesis chapter 18, verses 16 through 23. What was more remarkable to Abraham's hospitable service was his heightened sensitivity toward God. Abraham took the initiative to walk along with them, to send them on their way, in verse 16, but he also walked with them because the men were looking the direction of Saddam, in verse 16. Presently they made a sudden U-turn, in verse 22, to the direction of Saddam, in verse 22. True enough, Abraham's worst fears were realized. It was too late to warn his nephew Lot and the people who were living in Saddam. Abraham not only stood before the Lord in verses 22 and 27, he remained in verse 22 yet, in King James Version, standing before the Lord. The word describes Abraham's intercession, his intensity, and his insistence on saving Lot. The 3 men's questions was not directed at Abraham in verse 17, but it did not stop Abraham from directing them in a question. Third, be heartfelt in supplication. Genesis chapter 18, verses 24 through 33. Abraham's determination to save Sodom and Gomorrah was admirable and awkward. Not only was Abraham the first to use the audacious far be it in verse 25 twice, he dared to provoke the wrath of God in verses 27, 30, and 31 by raising if 6 times with the Lord in verses 24, 28, 29, 30, 31, and 32, moderating his request with 4 oh now, nah in Hebrew, and finally asking for increasing discounts from the modest 10 to 12% range, from 50 to 45, from 45 to 40, to a bigger 25% discount, from 40 to 30, then a much bigger 1/3 discount from 30 to 20, and finally twice asking God for a bold 50%, 20 to 10 reduction. Altogether, he had asked for a whopping 80% discount till it was too embarrassing. Yet the Lord did not regard Abraham as arrogant, angry, or antisocial. To the Lord, Abraham's request was respectful, not rude, rational, not ridiculous, radical, but not reckless. God had promised Abraham to be the father of many nations in Genesis chapter 17, verse 4, and that all nations on earth will be blessed through him in verse 18. Out of a good and godly heart, Abraham intervened without being asked. As the father of many nations, Abraham appealed for humanity and the world as a whole, not wanting to see a soul lost. In the end, he had no questions left for the judge of the earth. In verse 25, God left a more mature Abraham in awe of God's might and mercy. Abraham petitioned God to spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people in verse 24, But God did more than that. He will spare the whole place in verse 26. In conclusion, Jesus is the first person to be described as a friend in the New Testament. Would you be like Jesus, who was a friend of the tax collectors and sinners in Matthew chapter 11, verse 19? Do sinful, selfish, and stubborn people annoy you? Is your heart hopeful or hardened in the reaching lost sinners? As God's children, we are to love our enemies and pray for them, because God causes the sun to shine on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 44 and 45.